America's 250th birthday commemorates not just the revolution broadly, but also specifically the Declaration of Independence, whose principal author was Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson made his home, Monticello, in Charlottesville in Albemarle County. Now, I understand why it will be important to speak about Philadelphia or about Washington, D.C. this year. But 2026 is also a year about Albemarle County in Charlottesville and their place in the American fabric. Whenever friends visit me in Charlottesville, we tour Monticello. I've taken students there. Every time I go, I learn something new. It's a beautiful site, and a fascinating one, for viewing the architecture and decorative arts of Jefferson's age, for considering the lives of all the people who live there, of Jefferson and his ideas, of Jefferson's family and friends, the enslaved laborers who lived there, as well as for understanding the region's ecology. But it has also become a place for helping us, through considering this history, to become better citizens, a place to go to consider what it means to be an American today. To learn more about the civic potential of Monticello as a museum and as a site of memory, I met with Jane Kamensky, president and CEO of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. Jane Kamensky was a professor of American history at Brandeis and then at Harvard. Her books have won awards, including the New York Historical Society's American History Book Prize, and she joined Monticello in 2024. It was an incredibly inspiring conversation. Here's Jane now. Could you begin by introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm Jane Kamensky. I am the president and CEO of Monticello, and I'm an American historian.
Wonderful. What's new at Monticello, and what's new especially under your leadership?
Well, I came to an incredibly beautiful and significant place in order to underline the work that we do in civic capacity building among our staffs, with the Charlottesville community, and with our more than 300,000 guests from around the country and around the world. In the anniversary year of 2026, that civic capacity building work has two main sort of unifying themes. One, of course, is the Declaration of Independence, of which Thomas Jefferson was the primary author, and which so many people who lived and descended from Jefferson's plantation did so much to live out the promise of that soaring second paragraph. The other is leaning into civil dialogue and civil disagreement among the breadth of our visitors who come from every corner of the United States, as well as many countries around the world, bringing many opinions and political commitments with them. We're talking about the fact that disagreement is a feature and not a bug of a constitutional democracy, and leaning into our history for a kind of instruction manual or toolkit about how to disagree better, to use the phrase the National Governors Association championed a couple of years ago. So with that in mind, we've launched a tour called Founding Friends, Founding Foes that explores the vexed civic friendship of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and thinks about why they ultimately decided that their collective investment in the common project of the United States was more important than their profound differences about the way to realize that project. And we're also sponsoring, both with that tour and in freestanding editions, something called a Feast of Reason, which is a guided conversation to bring strangers, intact groups, families, people of joyously unlike minds together for rich conversation about our past, present, and future.
This is wonderful. So for listeners who may not know, Monticello is the historic site on the hilltop, the chateau of Thomas Jefferson, and of course the communities of people around him, sort of the maelstrom of people that surrounded this figure. Could you talk a little bit about what visitors can expect to find there?
So people come to Monticello through our visitor center, and there are galleries and orientation experiences there to get you ready for either the walk or the shuttle bus ride up the hill, where you enter on the east walk of Monticello and can go through the house. All experiences in the house are guided, and I would love to brag on our guide corps, who are far and away standard setters in the business. People can also purchase passes to walk the grounds and gardens. We do a lot of heritage agriculture and native plant gardening, guided by Jefferson's incredible records of the way that he botanized and the way that he and a staff of enslaved gardeners grew here, both for food and for beauty. So flower gardens and vegetable gardens.
It's an incredibly interdisciplinary site. I've always thought about Monticello a little bit as more alike with European chateaus than American house museums in a certain respect, because the grounds are so developed, because of this focus on landscaping, archaeology. Is there something to that?
Well, I think Jefferson would applaud that association, right? You know, France obviously an incredibly important season of his life, and what he saw in Italy and the classical tradition that he learned through books as well as through visits, profound architectural influence on Monticello as it is on our sister UNESCO World Heritage Site, the Rotunda at UVA. The gardens, I think that's a really interesting question. Take in the best of English landscape gardening, as well as the sort of more manicured and regimented French style in a way that is entirely American, right? Coneflowers and echinacea, and thinking about blending the specimen exchange that he did with European naturalists, including the Comte de Buffon, with the things that were flourishing here. It didn't always work, and one example of that is the vines that he began to plant on acres that are now part of Jefferson Vineyards, which Monticello also owns and operates. He originally brought over European cultivars and found that the Virginia climate of the 1780s and 1790s just sweated them out and killed them with humidity immediately. The wines that could be made here were made out of things like the scuppernong. Now, as our climate shifts and becomes more Mediterranean, we're finding that those European varietals flourish. So that kind of botanical experimentation that Jefferson pioneered in some ways continues. We're thinking a lot about what is a native species in 2025, where southern magnolias and mimosas are flourishing and oaks are having a terrible time. I think the tools of collecting information from around the county and around the world and thinking about what a sort of revised indigenous landscape looks like here is Jeffersonian and ongoing.
I'd like to go back to a point that you made earlier about the history of enslavement. That to me seems like one of the biggest intellectual developments in the interpretation of the site over the last generation, maybe the last 2 decades or so. I'm sure that that will not go away, but I'm curious what the next steps are, the next maybe turnings or new interpretations to add on to the site. Is the ecology of the site one such turn? Is 1776 and going back to the Declaration another such turn?
Absolutely. One of the distinctive things about the site is that Monticello so early embraced the public interpretation of American slavery and the enslaved community of the mountaintop. That dates back to the 1990s. Our Getting Word African American History Project was founded in 1993, which is one touchstone. And tours of the house also began in the 1990s to braid the experience of the enslaved community through discussions of Jefferson and architecture and cuisine and all of the other things that we interpret here. This is an act of world building. It does not diminish Jefferson, but restores him to the fullness of his surround, what he knew every day, right? In any given day in the historic past, Monticello was black space in the sense that maybe 10 times as many enslaved people of African descent were here compared to free people of European descent. So we're totally committed to restoring the fullness of that world and all of its contradictions. 1776 is an ideal moment to think about that, and leaning into the moment of the Declaration's creation for the anniversary in 2026, even though, of course, the Declaration is written in Philadelphia. All the while, Jefferson is longing to be here in Monticello. We talk about the ways that the Declaration sort of set the vision statement for human liberty and human rights in that soaring second paragraph, and the ways in which people on the mountaintop and from it strove to make those liberty traditions fit all Americans, and talk in exhibits along the South Wing, as well as tours in the House, about the contributions that enslaved people made to realizing the ideals of the Declaration. I think 1776 is also a sort of pregnant moment to talk about the fullness of that history, because while the Declaration did not end slavery, the Revolution really did end white silence about slavery. Slavery was never an unthinking part of the experience of Black people enmeshed in that global institution, but it was an accepted part of the world for almost all Euro-American colonists until the 1770s. And the liberty tradition that the Declaration both draws from and builds on leads people all across the colonies, first in Pennsylvania and in New England, to realize that the ideals of the country are incompatible with slavery. Jefferson knows this too, and fails to act on it in any significant way. And one of the things that I think we can teach in the anniversary of 1776 is, what is it to hold ideals and contradict those ideals, and know you contradict those ideals, and still not be able to see your way clear to meaningful action? Jefferson's predicament, in other words, is America's predicament, and to understand it with sympathy and humility rather than a kind of easy condemnation is precisely the kind of mental move that we need to move forward as a people.
This is incredibly compelling. I'd like to ask you specifically about the activities that you and Monticello are planning for 2026. Before I do, I have a kind of contextual question that comes to mind. You mentioned civics earlier. What was the phrase that you used?
Civic capacity building or democracy renewal. I think of the anniversary as being a kind of renewal of vows moment, right? One of the things we know through surveys in the United States is the percentage of people who think it's either important or very important, essential to live in a democracy, diminishes as age diminishes. So the greatest generation, 72% of them think it's essential to live in a democracy. They fought to make that true for the world, right? Millennials, younger millennials, and Gen Z, about 30% say that it's essential or very important to live in a democracy. One of the characteristics of self-government, as Jefferson knew, is that if you are not committed to govern yourself, you will not govern yourself. It is a demanding form of government that rests on the renewal of small c citizen capacity and commitment. So when we think about civics, that's what I mean, is that commitment to our self-government, to our collective thriving that we do in all kinds of groups. And I want this to be a place that people come and think about the ways that they contribute and could contribute.
I noticed you didn't use the expression civic education. I've been thinking about this phrase and why it sits a little bit strangely for me. I wonder if the idea is that everyone wants their political opponents to have more civic education. Civic education is something for the other guy, right?
We shouldn't feel that way about civic education, right? And I am part of a nationwide civic education project called Educating for American Democracy, which believes passionately in the need for civic education for all Americans, right? All inhabitants and citizens need to know how to drive the bus, right? It is a driver's only system. There are no passengers in a constitutional democracy. There are productive disagreements about what a civic education should look like. Just in a broad brush, people left of center believe in a more participatory and activated model of civic education, doing projects in the community, for example. And people right of center believe in a more content-based, caricatured as skill and drill approach. We actually need both. You need the content of our founding and the nature of our institutions in order to be able to operate them responsibly and think about the relationship between the past and the present. But participating in American public life also demands doing. So we think both in the Educating for American Democracy framework and here at Monticello about content, skills, and dispositions. So for our Founding Friends, Founding Foes tour, which is one of our signature anniversary offerings, the content is the relationship between Jefferson and Adams as it developed over the 50 years of their frenemyship. The skill is thinking about how they navigated difference, where it failed, and why it was worth the hard work of bringing it back together, and hopefully cultivating in guests a sense that, boy, that sounds a lot like relationships in their family, where the Trump voting guest has fallen out with his Harris voting crazy uncle because they can't speak the same American language anymore. So that's the skill, is civil disagreement. And then the disposition is curiosity and empathy, right? We want to speak to people in a way and engage them in a way that they take something home, so that the experience of visiting here ripples throughout the communities from which people have come. We're seeing hopeful signs, especially in the way that tour experience has been greeted, both by guests and in some nice recent media coverage.
It's striking to hear how visiting the site can be a transformative experience. It transforms yourself. It's part of working on yourself. I'm curious to hear more about how Monticello is interpreted as a site of national significance, because it's also a site of local specificity. It's also a site of global connections. And in particular, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the extent to which Monticello, as a historic site, is specific to and represents the particular character of 18th century Albemarle County and Virginia in particular in the nation's founding.
So it's a great question, Ben. And I think of our reach as being both deep and wide. So the global connections piece, the national significance is wide, and that's very important, right? It's important that a kid growing up in North Dakota learned something about Jefferson enough to think about wanting to see the place that's on the back of her nickel, that's a kind of mind's eye presence across the United States. Indeed, we worry about the diminishing use of metal currency, because that is we don't use the $2 bill anymore. The nickel is one of the things that sort of imprints that this is a site of pilgrimage. I think Monticello is also both of and for Charlottesville and Albemarle in profound ways, right? It comes out of the tangle of freedom and slavery that Edmund Morgan told us way back in 1975 is a unique contribution of Virginia to the American project, right? The fact that all of the wealth of this place in its post-Monacan incarnation was built by the bondsman's back, as Lincoln would later say, that this is a place that comes out of Virginia's tobacco boom, is, something that not only Jefferson himself, but his parents and grandparents and great grandparents knew as a reason for settling and then moving west from the Tidewater. I think it's also a resource that ought to be meaningful in a much more regular way than it has been to people in Charlottesville and the county. My colleagues and I are thinking about not only why we want visitors from all over the world and across the United States to seek a visit to Monticello in 2026, but why the Charlottesvillian who comes the day after Thanksgiving when she can't wait to get rid of her in-laws might come 4 times during the year to explore different facets of this history through things like our pursuits of knowledge conversation, our culinary diplomacy series, through visits to Jefferson Vineyards, garden walks, the place where we have the most frequent local resort is the trail that we maintain, the Saunders Monticello Trail, which is an incredible free public amenity that is really heavily used by the population of Charlottesville and surrounding towns. We would love to model that kind of low stakes usage so that the site felt like it belonged to Charlottesville, and Charlottesville had an incredible impact on it, just as it did in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Do you have a favorite spot in Monticello? I'm just dying to know. Is there a kind of hidden corner or a decorative art object?
Well, my husband's favorite is the little cuddy, as we call it, off the dome room, which was in Jefferson's granddaughter's time a sort of female and child space where they hid out from the sort of diplomatic grandeur of the first floor. I like seeing the writing spaces, right? The places where Jefferson is both consuming and producing news in his library and cabinet. I think the combination of that thought world and then just the physical labor of writing 22,000 letters, many of them copied by the polygraph machine, is incredibly compelling for me as a historian, thinking about like this is the place the documents came out of. And then if I can have a third choice, my office looks down across the kitchen gardens, the vegetable gardens, across the Piedmont. I think Jefferson did the preposterous thing of siting a plantation on a mountaintop, which is incredibly anomalous in the history of plantation architecture, right? What you want is the river that is the highway of getting your crops to market. He cited it up here as a place of vision and getting to take in that prospect every day, to see storms rolling across the Piedmont, to hear grade 4 and 5 Virginia studies teachers with their school groups outside saying, you know how we've read about the Piedmont? That's it. I love that sense of landscape and horticultural place too.
That's so wonderful. I know we're running a little low on time. We have a few minutes left. I'm just wondering, maybe 2 questions to wrap up. The first is, are there specific initiatives for 2026 at Monticello that we haven't discussed that you'd like to highlight?
So Declaration Book Club is a free open educational resource that you can find online at monticello.org/book club. It has been touted by both Maria Shriver in her Sunday paper and Karl Rove in the Wall Street Journal. So I would say it is striking a chord across the political spectrum. 3 meetings worth of short, punchy, interactive materials to think about what the Declaration meant and can still mean to all of us as one people created equal. So I would encourage your listeners to download the toolkit and think about the groups in which you gather that people might want to spend 3 meetings discussing the world of the Declaration and its living legacy.
Wonderful. And then the second is what 2026 means to you personally.
So I'm a child of the bicentennial, right? I was born in 1963, so I was at a very impressionable age in 1976, and remembering it as a great coming together of the people about things that were celebratory and silly. It was collective, right? We had a very different media ecology where people watched four channels, and bicentennial minutes, which did minute-long pieces of history discussed by celebrities with great cadence, were part of it. You too would have grown up with Schoolhouse Rock, right? That's a bicentennial production. So it was the earworm of 1776. And then those of us who grew up on the East Coast have, I talk to people regularly who have memories of seeing the tall ships. I think it was that you're looking at the same moon in the same sky kind of moment. It was also, and I've learned this retrospectively as a historian, incredibly important institutionally. So that Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom came out in 75 is no accident. The NEH invested hugely in stories of the founding that were whole histories. American social history got a huge boost then too. Something like a quarter of all state and local historical organizations that are still in operation in 2025 were founded in the time of the bicentennial.
The National Endowment for the Humanities is in a very different position than it was in the 1970s. I mean, the Getting Word project has also been supported by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Has that changed the landscape a little bit? The fact that it's an institution where there have been layoffs, it's under new pressure?
I think that we will see and are already seeing a lot more 250th innovation at the state and local level. And Virginia brags on Virginia 250 a lot, and justly so. It is the absolute paragon of state commissions and thoughtful about the ways that celebratory moments also think with the kind of deeper reflective engagement that the Virginia Standards of Learning call for in the classroom. So I want 2026 to be a moment where all of us across the political spectrum find our patriotism, right? We fly a common flag. It doesn't mean the same things to all of us. Our patriotic soundtrack is not the same soundtrack. That's a good thing. I've said that the anniversary is the tent pole in the fabric of the nation, right? We can all think about the fabric, how it's woven, what strands belong to us, which are threadbare and need repair, where we have, patched in important constituencies in the past, and what we want the fabric of the nation to look like in 2076. There's a 2076 project that's a youth organizing project thinking about leveraging 2026 to think about what you want for 300th. I want there to be a 300th. I want the United States to remain the last best hope of Earth. And an anniversary is an arbitrary thing, but it's an invitation to think about what each of us has to contribute in order for that to be so.
What a beautiful note to end on. Jane Kamensky, thank you so much for coming in to speak with me today. It's wonderful to meet you, and I'm looking forward to following with great interest all of these events and programs at Monticello this year.
Founding Footprints is a VA 250 project. America, made in Virginia. This podcast is a production of the Virginia Audio Collective at WTJU 91.1 FM. Hosted by Dr. Benjamin Bernard, with sound design by Ben Larsen and music provided by Blue Dot Sessions. If you'd like to explore the history of Charlottesville and Albemarle County, you can find more information at visitcharlottesville.org. Virginia is for history lovers.